Our next speaker, Tom Campbell, worked as a consultant for NASA within the Ares 1 program, assessing and solving problems of system risk. Campbell published a trilogy, My Big Toe, MBT, in 2003 that offered a complete cosmology based on the simulation hypothesis, including a theory of consciousness that can derive both relativity and quantum mechanics from first principles. Furthermore, Campbell's theory fully explains non-local weirdness. In terms of logical causal process, the MBT model has been successful at solving many outstanding paradoxes within and several major fields of study, including physics, philosophy, psychology, mind models, medicine, mind-body connection, biology, and theology. On June 6, 2017, Campbell published a paper in the peer-reviewed International Journal of Quantum Foundations entitled On Testing the Simulation Theory that outlines a series of quantum physics experiments that produce strong evidence that our reality is virtual and that consciousness is the computer. Welcome, Tom, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Diane. I'm Tom Campbell. I am a physicist and author of the My Big Toe trilogy. That toe is based on an in-depth understanding of consciousness, and it leads to a model of reality that derives a more general physics, that is, a more complete understanding of the objective world, and a more complete understanding of the subjective world, including the intuitive side of the subjective world, which is where all the psi information is. The topic of my talk is reality and the conscious connection. So here we are all at a symposium entitled The Simulation Hypothesis, Savant Syndrome, and Psi. What an eclectic combination of words. I think the organizer of this symposium, Dr. Diane Hennacy Powell, is either prescient, extremely intuitive, or knows a lot more than she's letting on. Or at the very least, if nothing else, this title demonstrates that Diane and probably most of the attendees have long ago transcended the limited thought space of academia. The subject is clearly the Savant Syndrome, and just what, one might ask, does the simulation hypothesis, concept that we live in a virtual or computed reality, and psi, the paranormal, have to do with it? Indeed, what I wish to offer you today is a scientific, that is, fully logical with no unusual assumptions, detailed explanation of the connection between Savant Syndrome, virtual reality, and psi phenomena. To do that within the time allotted is going to be challenging and necessarily somewhat superficial. Significant depth, logical derivations from first principles would take days, if not weeks. And I'm going to try to do this in 45 minutes with a little room for some questions. So first, let's list the obvious questions that the subject Savant Syndrome creates. In other words, if you meet someone who has trouble uttering a complete sentence or tying their shoelaces, but can immediately and accurately tell you the cube root of a 7-digit number that you randomly choose, or the first 25 digits of a specific prime number you specify, then there are some questions that just leap out at you. You know they haven't memorized this information, so 1, where does that information come from? How did it get there? Who put it there and why? Why does this information appear to be available only to a select few savants? And why are these savants often autistic or more generally cognitively disabled? 4, is this capability limited to the cognitively disabled, and if so, why? Or can the rest of us learn to access this information like this, and if so, how? 5, is there a scientific foundation, understanding that fully explains the Savant Syndrome? Well, at the end of my talk, I will come back to all 5 of these questions and in detail give answers to each of those questions. But first, I must explain some facts about consciousness. Otherwise, my answers may seem rather arbitrary. There is simply no time here for detailed derivations, but I assure you that the detailed derivations are available, and I hope you will seek them out. You will find them in my trilogy, the MBT website, and on the YouTube channel. Okay, first, consciousness is fundamental. Now, there is a pyramid that Dean Radin sometimes shows that describes the increasing complexity of the hard sciences. Sometimes it's called the hierarchy of scientific knowledge. From the materialist viewpoint, physics is at the bottom as the most foundational science. This is followed by chemistry, which is followed by biology. Okay, now this means that physics, chemistry together inform biology. And at the peak of the pyramid, above biology, is consciousness. Now remember, this is a materialist viewpoint. The implication being that the brain creates consciousness. Another one of those ideas that dominates the limited thought space of academia. As you see on this slide, consciousness cannot be packed into the objective physical space of physics, chemistry, and biology because it is subjective, not objective. I move consciousness from the tip of the pyramid to a foundational space beneath physics, as well as beyond the physical space of the physical scientists, into the subjective space of the non-physical sciences. Because consciousness is a non-physical phenomena, it is entirely subjective. Yes, this implies that physics can be logically derived from consciousness. Indeed, this can be and has been done. Modern physics is essentially bounded by quantum physics and relativity, and both of these can be directly derived from an understanding of consciousness. So what is consciousness? I define it simply as awareness with a choice. Now, the fact that it has a choice means that it has a free will choice, because if there is no free will, there is no choice. I start with the simplest possible form of consciousness, and that would be just an awareness that is, it's aware that it exists, perhaps that outside of itself exists, but that it can be in just one of two states. It can be this way or it can be that way. That's the sum total of its awareness. That's the beginning of awareness with a choice. It could choose to be aware of state A or state B. Now notice, if there's an awareness of choice, state A or state B, then that also brings time in. Time is fundamental. We've discussed time somewhat here today, so that was not part of my talk, but I will add that. If you can be in state A or state B, well, now I'm in A, next I'm in B, and then I go back to A. That's change. Change defines time. So time is fundamental, and free will is also fundamental to consciousness. Those three things, time, free will, and consciousness, cannot logically exist separately. They all have to exist together. All right. Now, I start with the simplest possible form of consciousness, and I let it evolve naturally, the way logic demands. And by that, I mean, I'm not going to make a model that says, well, consciousness could be like this, or it might be like this. I'm saying this model says that consciousness must be like this. Logic demands that it be. There are no other reasonable choices. From the logical necessities of this evolution, one can derive a more general physics, a more complete understanding of the objective world, and a more complete understanding of the subjective world, okay, the science of the subjective, including the intuitive side of consciousness, which contains all the psi phenomena. Now, I've been working on this a very long time. Except for the first 6 months of my first job after grad school, I've always had a dual career. One as an applied physicist, that was the day job, and the other as a consciousness researcher, that was the night job. I spent the best part of a decade doing consciousness research, about 15 to 20 hours a week, with Robert Monroe. This occurred in the 1970s, long before the Monroe Institute was born. We spent those years exploring the realm of consciousness and studying its possibilities. And I am still continuing that research today. Now, those of you who don't know Bob Monroe, he wrote the book Journeys Out of the Body, then Far Journeys, and then Ultimate Journey. And if you look at Far Journeys, he talks about some of his collaborators, and among them you'll find TC, physicist. Well, that would be me. From this research, I developed a set of consciousness facts, subjective facts, paranormal facts, things I knew to be true by extensive, repetitious experimentation. As a physicist, I also possessed a set of material facts, objective facts about the objective world, what we call the physical universe. I started looking for a logically consistent, overarching model of reality that would explain both sets of facts, a model that was falsifiable and required all facts to be defined only by multiple experiments. This model was published in February 2003 in the form of the My Big Toe Trilogy and has been evolving ever since. As with my scientific model, it should be judged solely, as with any scientific model, it should be judged solely on its ability to explain all the known facts and predict new facts, not on how well it conforms to current beliefs, that is, to scientific and cultural dogma. In constructing this model, I used the words and metaphors of modern computing because they most naturally fit the facts. That is true because consciousness is an information system. The MBT model of reality requires consciousness to be fundamental. That is one of those facts I learned while exploring the paranormal with Bob Monroe. I found that in those experiments, I could do things in the realm of consciousness that would affect and change what happened in the physical realm, but I could not do the opposite. Things I did in the physical realm did not change things in the consciousness realm. That meant that the arrow of causality went from consciousness to the physical. Consciousness is an information system. I call this system the Larger Consciousness System, LCS. Its evolution is driven by survival, just like ours. This means it is driven by the need to lower its entropy. Okay, that's its criteria for evolving, is that it lower its entropy. Okay, think of information system with just random bits. A system has nothing but random bits. It has no information. Randomness contains no information. If that system orders some bits and gives that ordering some meaning, it now has created information. Entropy is a measure of disorder. So as bits are ordered, the system lowers its entropy. Creating information and creating more useful and significant information lowers the entropy of the information system. Now, when I say consciousness is an information system, think about what are you conscious of? You are conscious of the information that's your sensory platforms. That is your sight, your hearing, your smell, your taste, your sense of feel. That information comes to you, and you then interpret that information to be this reality. So consciousness being information should not be such a hard stretch. Okay, the larger consciousness system raises or lowers its entropy according to the choices it makes. Positive evolution is made by making choices that lower its entropy. The larger consciousness system partitions off parts of itself as individuated units of consciousness. I call those IUOCs. Of course, they have free will because they are pieces of consciousness. Consciousness and free will and time all go together. Okay, these individuated units of consciousness are created in order to create more and better opportunities for the system to lower its entropy. In other words, it gives more opportunities for the system to evolve. Now, why is that? Well, if you have one monolithic thing, one consciousness, what can it do? What can it create? What can it become? Now, think if you had many pieces of consciousness, all with free will, all interacting, learning, and growing. What can that become? Well, there's just more possibilities when you have more free will units interacting with each other. That means there's more room to grow, more space in which evolution can take place. Okay. Now, those individuated units of consciousness are us, you and I. We are individuated units of consciousness. Now, the larger consciousness system also partitioned off a portion of itself to serve as the server or computer of a virtual reality that naturally evolves from a set of initial conditions and a rule set. The rule set defines how those initial conditions might change over time. It does this in order to provide its individuated units of consciousness more challenging, more consequential choices in order to enhance its own evolution. Okay, so we have all these individuated units of consciousness, and they can communicate with each other. The first virtual reality here is just the communication protocols. So they communicate, but that doesn't create a lot of meaningful choices. Evolution, making choices that help you evolve, is difficult. It's slow. So they create a virtual reality, but not by programming it, by setting up a rule set and initial conditions. What make those initial conditions be? Well, think of a very small space holding a plasma that is very hot under high pressure. And when the run button is hit, it starts expanding and cooling and turning into suns and planets and other things. Yes, the big digital bang. And, okay, it evolves. So that is our virtual reality, not programmed, but it evolves from our initial conditions and a rule set. And we, the individuated units of consciousness, we then log on. We play an avatar, just like you would in a virtual reality game. So you are a piece of consciousness. You are immortal. You play an avatar that is evolved in a simulation, created and computed by consciousness. Okay. Our so-called physical reality is a virtual reality computed by consciousness. This may seem to be far out on the edge, but if you judge this new paradigm, this model, on what it can explain, rather than on how closely it fits your current beliefs, you will find that all the fundamental paradoxes in both the hard and soft sciences, philosophy, the paranormal, and even theology, will completely disappear, and they will be replaced by detailed understanding of how and why reality actually works as it does. There's no new paradoxes created. Additionally, a new science of the subjective world is also delivered. And I do believe that this paradigm shift, though it is a very big paradigm shift and therefore very difficult for most people to wrap their minds around, as is any major paradigm shift, this one is probably a bigger shift than the ones we've had before, like flat Earth, round Earth, or are we the center of the universe, or are we not? Those were much smaller paradigm shifts than this, and so this one's going to take time. It's not going to be accepted very quickly because it's such a shift, but once you make that shift, all of those questions get answers and they fall into place very nicely. So all virtual realities that appear to have continuous motion have a speed limit. 1 pixel or quantum of distance per 1 pixel or quantum of time. So any virtual reality, if you take a pixel of distance divided by a pixel of time, that will give you the speed limit. And for our virtual reality, that's the speed of light. 1 Planck distance over 1 Planck time. Okay, it has to be constant. That's as fast as you can move through any virtual reality if you have continuous motion. 1 pixel for 1 unit of time. Now, when you think about a simulation, you know, there's always, if it is a dynamic simulation, that is a simulation where things can move and change, then there is an outer time loop. Okay, and that's the delta t I'm talking about. So yes, space and time are both pixelated. They're both digital. Okay, now, this virtual reality, what we call the physical universe, is most efficiently rendered as a probability-based model with its probability distributions generated directly from its predominantly deterministic rule set. Thus, it must be a top-down probabilistic simulation, not a bottom-up deterministic simulation, as the materialists believe any VR must be. Now, this understanding provides the foundational knowledge for quantum physics. Why is the world probabilistic? You know, particles aren't really particles. The quantum physics will tell you they're just probabilities of being particles. And when the measurement is made, the wave function collapses and we get a physical particle. But behind the scenes, behind the curtain, reality is just potential reality, probabilistic reality. This requires the larger consciousness system functioning as the VR server to create a process for determining future states. Okay, if you have a bottom up, in other words, you start with elementary particles, which then eventually build up to atoms, which build up to molecules, which build up our world, that's the bottom up. If you start with that, then you know what's going to happen next, because you have all the physics tells you that you have all the state vectors of everything that is, all the velocities, all the positions, then you can compute what happens next from that. When you have a top-down probabilistic model, there is no way to determine what's going to happen next. So you need to come up with some way to do that. Okay, so that's why I say that this idea requires the LCS to create a process for determining future states. Future states are determined by taking a random draw from the probability distribution of the possibilities. Okay, now taking a random draw from the probability distribution of the possibilities is not the same as taking a random draw from the possibilities. When it comes from a probability distribution of the possibilities, that means those things that are more probable are more likely to be drawn out in this random draw. Now, to support this process, a database is constructed, needs to be constructed, of all relevant future possibilities and their probabilities. I call that the future probable database. This is something that's required to help the rendering engine efficiently compute this virtual reality. As time moves on, the future becomes the past. And we also have a past database of everything that could have happened and the probability that it would have. And through that past database of probabilities, there's a thread that runs, which is what did happen. But that's just one thread running through the database. Now, this explains where the psi information comes from and why these databases, probable future and possible and actual past, must exist, and why they must be accessed through an intuitive channel. It's because they're in the non-physical space of consciousness. So they have to be accessed from consciousness. You, the player, are consciousness. And you have access to this information because you are a being of consciousness, a part of this larger consciousness system, you see. So you cannot access this information intellectually through physical channels. It only exists in this non-physical database that is required by the rendering engine. Okay, it is this process of taking a random draw from the probability distribution of the possibilities that produces the effect that quantum physicists metaphorically refer to as the collapse of the wave function to a physical result. Actually, there is no wave function. That's just a metaphor that physicists have come up with because that's the best way they can describe what their mathematics tell them is happening. Actually, it's a virtual reality, and those random draws taken by the rendering engine is what decides whether there's a particle or not. Now, a few things about simulations. A simulation creates an information-based reality, which is exactly what many, if not most, physicists now say that they see. If you talk to quantum physicists or atomic physicists or those who smash particles over at CERN, they will tell you that they think reality is information-based. But if you ask them what that means, they will say nothing. They don't know what to do after making that statement. Well, an information-based reality means it's a reality that can be computed, which means it's a simulation, which means it's a virtual reality. But your normal physicist doesn't want to go there because they don't know what to do when they end up with a virtual reality. The why, the who of it, and so on is something they do not yet understand. You are consciousness. You are an IUOC. You are immortal. You are a player in this virtual reality that we call the physical universe. You are here to evolve the quality of your consciousness. That's the same as lowering the entropy of your consciousness, okay? And when you lower your entropy of your consciousness, the system's entropy also is lowered because you are a part of that system. So we are part of the larger consciousness system's strategy for its own evolution. By making low entropy, high quality choices is how you lower your entropy, raise your quality. You are the sum of your choices. Your body is the avatar. You are currently playing. You make all the choices for your avatar. Without your choice, the avatar just stands still and does nothing. The avatar has a brain, but that brain doesn't actually think anything. It doesn't store anything. It doesn't process anything. All of that is done in consciousness. It is simply an avatar. Eye candy, so that the player can see more easily what's happening, what's going on, and what are the current interactions. A virtual reality exists only in the minds of the players. That is you, the IUOCs. Now, that fact explains the observer paradox. How come an observer observing what slit the particle goes through makes a difference into what happens at the screen? In other words, the double slit experiment has this paradox where the observer is key to the result. Well, that's because a virtual reality, it's just a property of virtual reality. That's true of all virtual realities. A virtual reality exists only in the minds of the players. A virtual reality exists because the server is sending each player a data stream. That player receives that data stream and interprets that data as the virtual reality. The player then makes choices, sends that back to the server. The server takes that choice, shows it on the screen, and also computes the interaction that choice will have with other players and with the environment. Okay, so it's just a data stream to a player. A virtual reality exists only in the minds of the player. That's why we have an observer paradox. Okay, now your consciousness and IUOC, your mission, your innate evolutionary drive is to lower your entropy by making lower entropy choices. Now, another way of saying that is raising the quality of your consciousness by making higher quality choices. Lowering your entropy within a social system of other individuated units of consciousness and the larger consciousness system itself requires you to get rid of your fear and the twin children of fear, your ego and your belief, to become more caring, cooperative, compassionate, empathetic, and other-centered, as opposed to self-centered. In other words, you evolve your consciousness by moving toward becoming love. Now, that's not just a happy thought that I thought I'd throw in. That is logically necessary. If you think of a social system with a lot of players interacting in it, you very quickly will see that in that social system, all of that interaction, say a certain number of actors with certain resources, and now they get to interact however they choose, that if you have fear, then that fear gives you a lack of trust. That lack of trust makes you self-centered, and you have a much less efficient, interaction between all those players. Whereas if you are cooperative and caring and sharing, then what those people can do with those resources becomes optimal. So I'm just giving you a very quick picture of the logic that gets you there, but lowering entropy, which is what we are here to do, how the reason that we actually exist and that this virtual reality exists, that is our purpose here, is to become more caring, cooperative, compassionate, empathetic, and other-centered, becoming love. That's our purpose. Now, consciousness is an information system, and as consciousness, you have direct access to much of the information within the consciousness system, and you have indirect access to all of it. This explains many psi phenomena. Where the information comes from, that database that was required, that database has everything that happens. Remember, it's all the possibilities and the probability that those possibilities come about. So it's everything. The rest of the psi phenomena are explained by the fact that focused being level, as opposed to intellectual level intent, modifies future probability. In other words, your intent changes those probability distributions on those possibilities. And by the fact that all consciousness is netted. So if you take those three things together, the databases, the fact that a focused intent modifies future probability, and that all consciousness, and I mean all, including your dog and your cat and your pet horse, all consciousness is netted. We are connected to each other. Now that we understand information, psi, and virtual reality, we can answer the 5 questions about the Savant questions that I put up there earlier. Okay. First question, where does that information come from? How did it get there? Who put it there and why? The information resides in consciousness as part of the database necessary for the server to efficiently compute our VR. It's available to us because we are pieces of consciousness. We cannot access it with our intellectual processing. We must access it with our intuitive processing. Why does this information appear to be available only to a select few savants? To access this information, one must use intuitive processing, which lies within the subjective mind, which lies outside of and orthogonal to the objective or intellectual mind. Very few people, especially within our culture, sufficiently develop their capacity for intuitive processing. If one's intuitive information processing is sufficiently developed, it produces accurate and reliable results. The same goes for intellectual processing. You need to develop your intellectual processing or you won't get accurate and reliable results either. Okay. 3, why are these savants often autistic, or more generally, cognitively disabled? Because their central nervous system makes it difficult for them to access the objective intellectual processing that most of us in our culture depends on. Thus, some develop their intuitive channel instead, just because it is there, and because it is all they have to work with, even though they are not encouraged to do so. Occasionally, if they're curious, after playing with the intuitive side, they discover that it can also have relevance to the rest of the world, that may encourage them to explore that intuitive space further. 4, is this capability limited to the cognitively disabled? If so, why? Or can the rest of us learn to access information like this? And if so, how? Almost anyone can learn to fully develop both their intuitive and intellectual information processing capabilities. Purposely developing these intuitive channels usually starts with meditation, which creates the mental discipline required. After that, it is mostly learning to stop letting the intuitive channel be suppressed by your intellectual channel and your fear, ego, and beliefs. The last question, 5. Is there a scientific foundation, understanding that fully explains the Savant Syndrome as well as other paranormal experiences? Yes, the MBT model provides a logical, scientific explanation of the Savant Syndrome and all other paranormal experiences, as well as scientifically resolving the outstanding paradoxes in both the hard and soft sciences, philosophy, metaphysics, and even theology, without creating any new paradoxes. Now, in closing, it would take time for me to run through lots of these paradoxes, such as we know that the speed of light actually changes in the 8th or 9th decimal place just a little bit every once in a while. Well, that is explained easily. You see, it has to do with the resolution necessary to create this virtual reality. You do not create a virtual reality with any more resolution than you need for what's going on there. And as what's going on there changes and needs more resolution, then you have to do that. And the resolution, remember, is the delta x and delta t. Well, delta x over delta t is the speed of light. You want to keep that ratio the same, but because it's a digital reality, you can't make that ratio stay exactly the same, because these things aren't continuous variables. They come in chunks. So you can only make it as close as the nearest pixel. And that means that the speed of light changes a little bit out in that 9th, 10th decimal place. And that's just one. There's literally dozens of these sorts of paradoxes that are in physics, all sorts of paradoxes that this model answers. Matter of fact, I look for paradoxes, things that people don't understand in any field. And I have not found one yet that this new paradigm does not provide a very clear logical explanation. Well, that is the end of my talk, and I guess we'll see if there's time left for questions.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay.
I enjoyed your talk. So we do have some questions. One's from one of our other speakers, Rizwan Burke, and he asks, hey, Tom, great to see you. Any update on the experiments being done based on your paper on testing the simulation theory that you can share publicly? Yes, and I have some good news there. And I have 2 different places now doing the first experiment. I have 5 experiments, and those experiments will lend strong evidence to the fact that this reality is virtual and that consciousness is the computer. And the first one, I suspect to have results in weeks, if not maybe a month at most. I was promised results by the end of August. Well, here we are at the end of August, and we don't quite have results yet, but I think we're getting close. And from what they tell me, within another 3 weeks, certainly within another month, they will have the results to the first experiment. And that first experiment basically is a quantum physics experiment that tries to more specifically focus on what is meant by which-way data. And right now, the way the physics community has decided to go, I think is wrong. And of course, they would think my theory is wrong, and the experiment will tell which one of us is wrong. So within a month or less, we will get that answer. Now, you'll find that answer if you go, or you'll find that announcement when I get an answer at CUSAC. CUSAC is Center for the Unification of Science and Consciousness. CUSAC.org will get you there. So that's when the announcement will be made, and plus then I'll make some videos. However it comes out, I will be
announcing it.
Can you elaborate just a little bit more? I mean, you've got us curious now. What
Well,
you're doing.
I have like these 5 experiments. That one is to settle this dispute between myself and physics as it is now. I think they've wandered on the path, and they've done that because they're trying to save their belief in materialism. And I think this will show them that they're incorrect in that belief. So we'll just see how that works out. It's an experiment. Experiments define facts. I've got some other experiments that do some things that are impossible, just like the double slit experiment did something that was impossible. It had particles going through 2 slits, and those particles should have just piled up behind each slit. That's what material physics would say, but they don't. They, for no apparently reason, they arrange themselves in an interference pattern, even though it's just one particle at a time being sent through the slits. They're not acted on by any other force, anything external. They just do that. So that's a minor miracle that has been stirring up physics. It's what they call weird physics since the early 1900s, about 100 years ago, a century ago. And I have some that will do even a little snazzier miracles. I have one that an experimenter will be able to tell how a random decay of a radioactive source will decay. Like this next decay that comes out, the next particle comes out of the source will come out in this direction. Well, that's impossible because we know decay is just random. So if the experimenter can do that, that will be a big thing. And I have another one that will allow the experimenter to determine whether a photon will either reflect or be transmitted through a beam splitter, which is just a piece of material that half the time lets the photon transmit through it and the other half of the time reflects it, but it's random. So again, the experimenter will be able to say what the future is going to be of how that particle will interact with that beam splitter. So both of these experiments tell you, and they do it in such a way that you almost have to come to the conclusion that the system is aware, it's conscious, because depending on what the experimenter does, the experiment turns out differently. And it's dependent on the information that the experimenter has to force that system to do one thing or another. Similar to the double slit, but just 2 new things. So these experiments and a couple of others are ongoing. I've had trouble getting them done because when I mention the C word to hardcore materialists, nobody wants to be involved with it because they don't want their institution to be known as doing pseudoscience that has anything to do with consciousness. But I have found some labs that'll do it. One of them, I have a contract with them that forbids me of discussing who's doing it. And, so the source has to remain anonymous because they will do the experiment because they want the money, but they don't want to be known that they did the experiment. Now, if it comes out the way I say, they'll change their mind rather dramatically, and they will very much want to take credit for, doing an experiment that is very meaningful to physics in general. So in the near future, we shall see. But I think, Diane, that this new paradigm will eventually, how many decades or centuries that'll take, will become the next big major paradigm shift in science. And it's not only in science, it's in everything. It's about love is the answer. Big paradigm shift. I don't think it'll take 100 years. I think it'll only take maybe another decade or 2. But it's hard when you have such a huge change in perspective to get people to even look at it seriously enough to agree with you. Now, all the physicists that have read the book and listened to my work so far have been very encouraging. Matter of fact, on this paper that we have co-authors. One of them is a guy from Caltech. That's a pretty prestigious, house. And the other one is from JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So those are 2 kind of high-end institutions, and guys there support it. But most physicists don't even know that it exists. So I'm not even on the radar just yet, but one day that will change.
Yeah, well, I hope to help make that change. Thank you. Yeah. So another question that we have is from Irina Rogozina. I hope I didn't mispronounce that too badly. What is the probability that all simulations within an ensemble produce Homo sapiens if they run unconstrained? Or do the apes get an assistance to evolve into Homo sapiens from the VR designers?
Okay, well, that's also a good question. You know, it's not all the simulations in an ensemble. We start the simulation with initial conditions and a rule set, and then it chugs on. But this simulation has a very focused purpose. It's not just to see what happens. It's to produce avatars to provide better and more productive experience for the individuated units of consciousness. And yes, just when we do things like that in the computer lab for a purpose, what we do is we tinker with the experiment until it fulfills our purpose, what it is we want it to do. And no doubt the system, the larger consciousness system, has tinkered with this evolving virtual reality to make it come out to suit their purpose. I think there's no doubt at that. Matter of fact, this one thing that I mentioned, that our intent modifies future probability, that I think was a little tinker that was added by the system to make the evolutionary process speed up. In other words, you have a moth. This is from a pretty old example. You have a moth and it gets here by a ship and it's all white, but it goes to London, which is very dirty in the 1800s and full of coal dust, and it has an intent to be able to not be eaten, an intent to blend in. And because of that intent, it modifies future probability, and within just 50 or 60 years, it turns into a black moth. Whereas if you just let that moth do its normal, Darwinian thing, which go through all the possibilities randomly, until it eventually landed on one that worked and then persisted, it should have taken tens of thousands of years. So that's just another one of those anomalies that gets explained. So that speeds up the evolutionary process. And yes, I do believe that there was some meddling with that process, and it didn't just happen entirely by, what do we call it, mutation, random mutation is not the only thing at work.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting point, because that has been one of the big questions in evolution, this idea of punctuated evolution, where you see you've got these gaps in what we think of as the evolutionary tree, and it's like, how did that much change occur that rapidly?
Yeah, and the more evolved the system, the lower entropy the system, then the more it's going to be able to focus that intent to change. So the more evolved the different species come, the more quickly they are able to evolve more. So it's like an accelerating factor in the evolutionary process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the things that my work with the savants has made me think about the sense of embodiment as being an illusion, which fits in with this idea that that our body is just our avatar in this virtual reality. But they also have this altered perception of time, and I was thinking that maybe time, just like embodiment, was part of the simulation, but you see time as being something that is more fundamental than that. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
It's fundamental, but it's our virtual reality, okay? Our physical universe that is a virtual reality has its own clock, has its own outer loop of time as it's computed. Other virtual realities, and ours is not the only virtual reality that turns out to be like a physical place. There's lots of virtual realities that are have very loose rule sets. Okay, like in your dream space. In your dream space, you can teleport, you can fly in your dreams. That's another virtual reality, but it doesn't have such a tight rule set, that defines the energy between all causality. All right, so there are multiple multiple virtual realities of multiple kinds of rule sets, some tight, some not so tight. The ones that have tight rule sets are like ours. They're physical because every energy exchange is designed to meet a certain criteria for it to be causality. It has a very detailed causality in it, not a lot of room. When you die, you go to another virtual reality, transition reality, and it has its own purpose and its rule set. So each one has its own time scale. And as you explore consciousness, you'll go through different sorts of time scales. You can spend what seems like a month in a virtual reality and come back and only 3 hours have passed here. So there's different time scales in there, but the time scale, the clock, the fastest ticking clock, or the one that has the highest frequency, is the system itself. And that clock, of course, it's just a 1 0 1 0 1 0. It's just a state flipping thing, makes a metronome. And everything else, all the other virtual realities are slower than that. They all are slower than that. So the master clock at the larger conscious system probably goes through a billion ticks, where our clock that runs hours just goes through one tick, maybe 1 second. So yes, time is a little different. As you go different places, time's running different speeds. Things happen in different ways. So that consciousness space isn't locked into time of our physical space. Those times are different. But yes, time is fundamental.
Well, I think so. This sounds like this needs to be an additional sort of adjunct to the theory of relativity.
Yeah, well, what it does is it gives, the theory of relativity works because it's defined within a 3D space. That's once you define space, and the way you make space is you say, here's a point, and here are 3 mutually orthogonal unit vectors at this point. Well, now you've defined all space, out to as close as you can get to infinity in all directions in 3 dimensions. So that's how you make space. It's just that easy. And within that space, you have the rule set, and relativity is based primarily on this concept that c is a constant, the speed of light is a constant. That's the key idea. Once you understand that, then relativity flows just by doing some math. The rest of it flows out pretty naturally. But the thing that they don't understand about relativity is, why should c be a constant? Well, like I said, it's easy to understand when you realize that this is a virtual reality. Every virtual reality has a speed limit. It has to be a constant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So we have a question here from Ramses de Leon, and he says, could you elaborate more on the relationship between consciousness and entropy? How do you interpret the second law of thermodynamics under this model? Okay.
Well, I mentioned the relationship to entropy, that consciousness is an information system. Information is created by lowering entropy, by structuring or modifying bits to have some kind of ordering bits. Okay, so now entropy is something that you can never quite get to the end of, right? We don't get to zero entropy, just like we don't ever get a temperature down to 0 degrees Kelvin. We can only approach entropy. And entropy also has the characteristic that if you don't put in energy to lower your entropy just naturally tends to increase. And consciousness is the same way. If you don't keep working to keep your entropy low, keep putting effort into caring and sharing and cooperating and being part of the solution rather than part of the problem, then your entropy starts to increase, and your fear and your ego and your beliefs start to grow. So this idea that you become enlightened, you get to a point that you understand the nature of reality, and now you're done. It's not like that. The point is that you get to that point where you understand the nature of reality, then you understand that your purpose is to contribute, is to care, is to share, and being done is all about you, not about sharing. So you want to get back, and you want to help, and you want to be a part of the solution. Now, if you don't work at it. If you say, oh, I'm done, I'm just going to quit. Well, when that happens, you start de-evolving. Entropy starts increasing and you start de-evolving. So you always have to have your hand into the game. You always have to be a player. You always have to be trying to be helpful. That's the way it works. So there is no end. So the entropy here works very much like the entropy in normal physics. For another thing that's the same, another way of looking at entropy is the ability of a system to do work. The higher the entropy, the less work that a system is capable of doing. Highest entropy, it can't do anything at all. Low entropy, it has more power. And it's the same way here. As you lower the entropy of your consciousness, you become more powerful individually. You as an individual become much more powerful. Now, to an example of that in the world, look at the people who have been hugely powerful, have moved ideas and whole continents, matter of fact, all over the world. We'll look at Nelson Mandela. We'll look at Martin Luther King. We'll look at Gandhi. And they were people who cared. These were people who were about being part of the solution. It was love. It wasn't fight back with guns. It was fight back with higher ideals. And we think these people, because they aren't physical in the way they do things, we think maybe they are less powerful, but that's not the case. As you lower your entropy in your consciousness, you become more powerful, more able to help. And the paranormal, of course, becomes open to you. The more you do this, if you're interested in paranormal, it's just there. It's part of developing your whole consciousness. Consciousness has two channels. It has the intellectual channel and it has the intuitive channel. And most of us never develop that intuitive channel, but all the paranormal things are there as much as you want them or are interested in them if you just develop that intuitive channel.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I'm going to take one more question, then we'll take our break. And it's from Jacob Glazier. Hi, Tom. I wonder how you might respond to the claim that the analogy of consciousness as computer and the metaphor of a computer have only become recently available, and therefore there might be better future or past analogies we could use. Okay.
Yes, my model, I talk in my terminology, I talk about consciousness as a computer system, an information system. But that is just my model here. I don't claim that this model is the absolute truth. This model is just a model. And models need to be alive. A model of reality needs to change. It needs to grow with the future. So yes, as future understandings grow, as more experience comes around, I suspect any model will grow or change its metaphors, perhaps. We had the Buddha, 2,500 years ago, saying that reality, was virtual. He didn't say that. He says it was an illusion. It's basically the same thing. So people have understood this for a long time. My model agrees with his model, but it uses terminology that people today can understand more readily. And if another 2,000 years from now, it'll probably be in a totally different language than it is now. And that's as it should be. Models need to be open to change. Models are not the answer. They're just a way of structuring and understanding in order to help us see bigger pictures. So the model is I run into something, when I get to a thing that I can explain with my model, then my model's deficient. I need to either, expand it, extend it, or throw it out and start someplace else. That's what you should do with models. They're just there to help people understand things at the time and place where they're most useful. And then time moves on and they move on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would agree. That's definitely my approach. And who wrote the code for the rendering engine? Stephen Hall had another question.
Who wrote that code for the rendering engine? Well, that would be the same people who came up with the initial conditions and the rule set. It was just part of what the larger consciousness system did. Remember, the system's been around a very long, long time and has been evolving by lowering its entropy. And the more you evolve, the quicker it is to evolve more. it's again, the more you learn, the easier it is to learn more. Here we are as humans, and we're doing genetics now. Our evolution is not just random, but it's in our hands to some bit. So this is an old system that's been around. It decided it needed a system to help itself evolve more rapidly, more rationally. So it created a part of itself to serve as the computer, a part of itself to serve as us. So we make this collective, which is more powerful than a single thing. And it develops the whole system. So that's how, the simulation gets there. It's not somebody brilliantly programs it. Now, our simulation, think of it this way, big digital bang, take one. Oh, that only went for 20 seconds and bombed. Okay, let's turn gravity up a little bit, turn these other constants down a little bit. Now, big digital bang, take two. And when we finally get the big digital bang, take 10,000, now we have constants that have been honed, that have been finagled out to 8 or 9 decimal places to be just what they have to be in order for our universe to be stable. And that's another one of these paradoxes, is how is it that we have these cosmic constants that are a half dozen of them, and they all have to be the way they are out to 8 decimal places, or the whole universe would collapse on itself. How did that come about? You see, that sparks ideas in, what they call, intelligent design. Well, yes, there is intelligent design here. That's why those constants all are so tuned to each other. It's because there was trial and error over lots and lots of tries before we got them to work and produce a virtual reality that would do the things that it was needed to do.
Oh, no. Well, thank you. So I need to end the session now, but we'll see you again.